Content advisory. This story discusses disturbing historical crimes and references preserved human remains. Listener discretion advised. Everyone wanted her, until the secret of Manaus changed everything. That sentence alone could have been the city's gossip for weeks, whispered under the verandas, repeated over coffee in the Mercado Adolfo Lisboa, carried by riverboats cutting through the black water of the Rio Negro. In the years after the rubber boom, Manaus lived half in memory and half in sunlight. Ornate mansions, lace ironwork, and a society that still measured itself by dances, imported fabrics, and the circle of acquaintances who counted. Helena Vasconcelos stepped into that world like a camera flash, impossibly young, alive in white silk, the widow of a colonel twice her age. She was all posture and perfume, and for a time her presence rearranged the town's daily gravity. To understand why a secret could overturn that gravitational pull, you need to understand the town and the way desire operates in small cities. Manaus, in the late 1940s, was not the sprawling metropolis it is now. Streets ran like veins toward the waterfront. News came on the slow rhythm of boats and telegrams. Everyone had a line to someone who knew someone else. Status was visible in the obvious ways. A borrowed carriage, a French gown, the placement of one's name in the social columns. Helena's name spent entire paragraphs there. She was 25 when her husband, Coronel Augusto Vasconcelos, died in 1948. The colonel, a man of a different generation and fortune, left Helena a house on Avenida Getulio Vargas, a two-story colonial with a deep veranda, shuttered windows, and a locked second floor that everyone politely avoided mentioning. The house had once been a testament to wealth accrued in earlier cycles of the rubber economy, tiled floors worn by parties, a formal garden turned private. Helena moved into that house wrapped in mourning and fine cloth. Her dresses seemed to contrive light. Her perfume, French, thick, floral, arrived before she did and lingered long after. Men who might otherwise hesitate found themselves offering carriages and letters and promises for the smallest of attentions. At first, the story around Helena read like a romantic novel. Floral bouquets arriving at the gate, invitations multiplied, the curious hush of citizens watching a carriage pass. Her name threaded through conversations at the Sociedad Amazonas and at the Catholic parish. There were merchants who adjusted their credit to appear in her circle, and municipal officials who asked to be seen at her Sunday teas. She was beautiful in the particular, unquantifiable way that small towns place on a woman who seems to demand notice rather than request it. But desire has a shadow. Small details, when stacked together, become evidence. Neighbors notice the little oddities first. A housekeeper named Benedita, who had been with the family long enough to know the cadence of the house, moved with a nervous punctuality that made people wonder. There were visitors at unexpected hours who left through back alleys rather than through the front door. Purchases came in that seemed out of place. Concentrated essences and dyes, surgical instruments catalogued in town books as odd medical supplies, and crates of burlap sacks described only as materials. A second-floor window remained stubbornly shuttered against the sun, and the key to that floor was never seen in public. Perfume, too, behaved oddly. What should have been an ephemeral luxury turned into a faint, persistent odor that neighbors compared to the smell of florals stewing in heat. Someone joked it was a ghost. Someone else said it was the lingering memory of the colonel. Others kept their distance. The town tolerated eccentricity much as it tolerates the weather, as a fact to be commented on without action. That tolerance stretched until there were absences, men who courted her and then disappeared from the usual ties of business and friendship. The first to be noticed was Sebastião Moura, a young merchant who had been at Helena's side at a public fair. He stopped meeting at the shop. He missed civic events. Then Carlos Eduardo Santos, a man known for his punctuality, vanished without apparent cause. Dr. Antonio Ferreira, a respected local physician, came to court Helena for a short, rumor-rich season, and then ceased to answer the calls that made his life public. When a pattern appears, it convinces more sharply than a single oddity. The absent become evidence by their absence. That pattern, at first merely rumored, began to accumulate names in Banda de Rua cafes and at the football grounds. But Manaus was a town hemmed in by the river and custom. The municipal police had limited resources, and a single accusation could ricochet into social ruin without offering clear grounds for action. The police officer most frequently mentioned in the records was Delegado Firmino Campos, a pragmatic, methodical man who prided himself on procedural caution. Firmino's files show a mix of neighbor statements, half-remembered dates, and requests for official clarification, enough to worry him, but not at first enough to justify a full-scale search of a private home belonging to a socially prominent widow. Then Dr. Ricardo Mendes arrived in town. Ricardo was 29, recently returned from medical study that emphasized modern observation and method. He carried with him, according to letters in a municipal archive, both a provincial humility and a hunger to be taken seriously. He set up a small clinic near the Mercado and quickly developed a reputation for careful diagnosis. He was also, by many accounts, unconventional in his social approach. He was curious about details other men dismissed. That curiosity played a dangerous role when he turned it toward Helena. He had seen Helena at an evening reception. The two spent several weeks at conversational distance. Some of the things he noticed were medical and simple. She seemed pale when she thought the light inconveniently, and there were moments when her hands trembled as though early with nervous fatigue. But Ricardo reported, later in testimony, that he also smelled something strange in the house. Not the clean, floral top notes of perfume, but an undercurrent that suggested chemicals and long concentrated odors. He could not specify what they were, only that they lingered in a way that modern medicine might call inhalant residue. He began to ask questions, gently at first, about the second-floor room. The consistent social answer was that it was private, a place for storage, or simply a wound of the colonel's memory no one should open. Men laughed it off after the third glass of wine. Women lowered their voices and suggested the matter was indecent for public speculation. But Ricardo began to keep notes. He drew little comparisons between Helena's reported suitors and the calendar of their absences. He found that some of the men who had courted her were not merely absent from parties. They had stopped answering letters, their businesses showed gaps, and a few families asked quietly for information. Ricardo's curiosity, combined with the knot of absences, pushed him to approach Firmino. A pragmatic police officer is rarely thrilled when a young doctor marches into his office with suspicions, but Firmino could not ignore the accumulation of testimony. He did what he could within the constraints of law. He discreetly collected statements, took inventories of the men last seen at Helena's house, and prepared to watch. It's worth noting that this was not a story of immediate outrage or mob hysteria. Manaus held its proprieties. The press at the time, what there was of it, was careful. Families hoped explanations would be mundane, perhaps business trips, perhaps the colonel's old associates moving away, perhaps courtship gone sour. In a city where reputations could be healed by time and patience, rumor required corroboration. But corroboration came in small, clinical measures. Grocery ledgers showed that sacks of an unusual substance had been delivered to the house, labeled in handwriting, later identified as Helena's. A neighbor, quiet and elderly, reported seeing a shadowy figure move from the back of the property toward a riverboat late one night. Another man testified he'd seen Benedita carrying heavy bundles at dawn on several occasions, moving them toward a shed behind the property where the smell seemed strongest. These were not conclusive in a court of law, but they were enough to make some people uncomfortable. to make others ask the two legal words that unspooled community tension. Who benefits? A strange sort of social calculus operated in the town. Helena benefited from attention and the social capital that flowed from it. The colonel's death had made her the steward of the estate, and with that steadiness of wealth came a solitude people could misinterpret. But the missing men were not only social capital, they were the human line that connected Helena to the community, and their absence began to unravel a pattern that could no longer be explained away. It was Ricardo's stakeout that would break the complacency into action. On a wet November night in 1950, Manaus is never dry in imagination for long. Ricardo stationed himself in a rented house across the narrow lane from Helena's property. He was not alone. A friend from the municipal hospital kept company at a distant window, their conversations low and measured, their cigarettes sending small swirls into the humid air. The rain softened sounds. The river breathed a close, slow exhale. Manaus at night becomes a city of small lanterns and oppressive warmth. In that atmosphere, every small sound enlarges. Ricardo had read the pattern and decided to look, not to confront. He wanted evidence. The flicker of a lamp in that second-floor window, the foot of a man carried down the stairs, the bell that might signal the removal of something heavy. For hours, nothing happened. The colonial house maintained its polite secrecy. The shutters remained closed, the veranda lights downvote, a domestic theatre untouched. Then, near the small hour, a single second-floor window threw a thin line of light into the street. It is important, when reconstructing these moments decades later, to keep the smallness of them. A candle, a kerosene lamp, or perhaps a weak electric bulb. Whatever the source, the light was a violation of the house's usual nocturne. Ricardo could see figures move in shadow. He later described in official testimony a shape that bent and straightened with the methodical precision of someone doing labor inside. Not the gait of a social visitor, but of someone attending to a task. The following days unspooled with the slowness of official procedures and the speed of gossip. Once the light was reported, Firmino moved. But moving in a social environment like Manaus is delicate work. A house owned by a widow of rank cannot be entered without cause. The law requires warrants, and reluctant witnesses require careful coaxing. The police began with questions, then quietly obtained a search order. The orders are blunt in paperwork and long in moral consequence. A judge signs, the town shifts, and a private life becomes public record. Before the search, Helena continued her rituals. One October afternoon, reports converge on a date between late September and early November, she received visitors in a way that made the papers later call to mind the normalities of her life. Tea in the front parlour, laughter that did not feel strained, the perfume trailing behind her like a companion. Benedita moved through the house like a shadow steward, folding linens, arranging the back rooms, carrying sacks that were declared mundane at the time. Laundry, the gardener's tools, the dry leaves of an old parlour plant. It's in these everyday movements that the extraordinary hides. Yet beneath the ordinary, people began to notice other things. Letters that should have been answered were not. A merchant with accounts across town found invoices unpaid and then simply stopped collecting at his last known address. The colonel's staff, older men who had served the household for decades, spoke to police with the tired patience of men who had once seen such disruptions before and taken them as private tragedies. They confirmed the deliveries of odd crates. They spoke, reluctantly and in fragments, about a second floor that held the colonel's memorabilia and other private artifacts. No one had reason to pry, they said. The culture insulated private habit with the thin membrane of respectability. Helena's defense, projected through her few public remarks and later through courtroom words, would later claim a broader rationale. A pursuit, she said, to preserve beauty and protect what time robs. The phrasing is important for the way it was received, an aestheticization of an action that for others had no poetic framing. In the town's parlance, such a defense sounded at first like the rambling of a woman who wanted to be understood on her own terms. In court, the same phrasing would become a legal strategy, an attempt to recast an illicit act as research. For now, in these early days, it remained the curl of one possible explanation among many. Investigations, even those with moral urgency, proceed through social friction. Friends and acquaintances shift into witness. The circle of those who had courted or spent time with Helena found themselves placed under the cool light of official inquiry. Families convened. A few publicly denounced rumors as slander. Some left town. Others, like Dr. Antonio Ferreira, had already been noted as absent. Names that once implied intimacy became evidence lists. One element that repeatedly recurs in both police files and the testimony that followed was Benedita. A long-serving housekeeper, she occupied a difficult position. Loyal to Helena, imbued with a responsibility for discretion, and reportedly subject to pressure. In later statements, she would claim coercion, a suggestion that her participation, whether active or merely passive, was not entirely voluntary. At the time of Ricardo's stakeout, people whispered about her movements. Bundles moved at dawn, a rigidness in her step that suggested she had rehearsed the gesture of carrying. Small towns are cruel, and servants are nearest to rumor by virtue of proximity. For the investigators, the evidence accrued in degrees rather than in sudden revelation. A ledger here, a testimony there, a neighbor's recollection. Each piece sharpened the suspicion into a plan. Delegado Firmino, who had waited for the law to dictate his tempo, now had cause for action. The municipal authorities convened in a way that made a public search possible without immediate scandal. They assembled a small team, informed the judge, and secured the necessary paperwork to enter a private home. The plan was careful, as required by the law, to avoid accusation of impropriety, to preserve dignity while seeking truth. The night before the operation, Manaus slantwise folded into its humid self. Those who were directly involved in the forthcoming search did not talk loudly about it. Ricardo slept poorly, reporting later he had felt an odd mixture of dread and responsibility. He had seen the second-floor light and felt the obligation to follow it to its consequence. For him, the house became a clinical mystery, a symptom, a set of anomalies, a collection of artifacts that might explain absences. For the town, it had become an unpleasant possibility that something valued in social currency, beauty, charisma, status, might have been hiding something monstrous. The morning of the search arrived with the hush of expectation. Men from the municipal police, a few constables, and a court-appointed official gathered near the gate. They moved with official language and formal procedures, knocking politely and presenting the warrant. In a small city, the sound of a warrant being read is a public event. It gathers neighbors. People clustered discreetly at the market windows, at low fences. The riverboats paused longer at the pier. The social world held its breath. When the door opened, it yielded the domestic world behind it. A front parlour, kept as if for guests, portraits on the walls, the colonel's study with a desk that smelled faintly of tobacco. The search proceeded room by room. The kitchen, the servant quarters, the back rooms where the gardeners stored tools. Each room told a muted part of the house's story. A drawer with old letters, a closet of dresses, a sewing kit abandoned mid-use. Then the housekeeper led them, with her small, practiced gestures, to the locked second-floor door. The lock had always been a symbol in neighborhood rumors. Now it was an object with a key and a legal obligation. Firmino had the lock broken under the warrant, and a small crowd filed up the steps where, for so long, only silence had reigned. The shuttered window allowed a shaft of filtered light to land on a carpet of dust. The room itself smelled of a concentrated blend of chemicals and something older. The investigators moved with procedural detachment, but the notes they filed later betray a tempo of surprise. Surgical instruments arranged not in medical order, but in the careful logic of someone experimenting with preservation. Glass containers labeled in a handwriting later identified as Helena's, some with small amounts of fluids suspended inside, and pages, cadernos, neatly bound, page after page of notes on techniques, measurements, and a personal vocabulary that equated lasting beauty with a state worth pursuing beyond social convention. Benedita's presence there, her admissions under questioning, would later make the room more than a curiosity. She spoke later of being coerced, of being told to clean, to prepare, to mend, to hide. She spoke in clipped sentences, sometimes contradicting herself in minor details, but the weight of what she said aligned with what the investigators found on the shelves. Precise notes that referenced the names of men, lists that matched the inventory of absences, alongside recipes for preservative solutions and records of experiments. The cadernos did not tell a tale in ordinary terms. They laid out an obsessive project. In Helena's handwriting, the logic attempted a kind of clinical explanation, the degradation of flesh as a theft of beauty, the quest to arrest decay through technical means, the belief that permanence could be engineered. There is an inevitable temptation, when recounting such findings, to equate motive with method. The town wanted explanations that fit a moral grammar: jealousy, greed, madness. The documents, however, hinted at something more complicated, a mind that mixed scientific curiosity with aesthetic fanaticism. To some degree, Helena's notes were a hybrid text, part laboratory log, part diary, part manifesto on beauty. She quoted old medical treatises in shorthand, measured temperatures and concentrations, and annotated with the names of the men who had been present for certain tests. The writing suggested intent of a kind that in a court of law would be difficult to reconcile with purely accidental outcomes. Even so, the discovery in that locked room was not announced in lurid detail to the townspeople. Reports were careful, and the press left out graphic particulars. The language chosen in the public records circled the edges of what was there. Preserved parts, containers, instruments, notes on preservation. The aim was to inform rather than to inflame, to convert a private horror into a legal case without devolving into spectacle. For those who stood near the gate that day, the sight of the house in daylight made the rumor feel like a physical thing. The perfume that had hung in the warm air now had a different character, one colored by the knowledge of what lay behind closed doors. The raid did not end the story. It was the hinge. It moved the town from suspicion to prosecution, but it did not unspool every knot immediately. Why the colonel had died when he did, and whether his death bore connection to later events, remained a matter of recorded suspicion in some quarters rather than proven fact. The municipal archives record an investigation that notes anomalies without concluding foul play. In public memory, however, suspicion would later harden into rumor. For Dr. Ricardo, the raid validated a professional and moral line he had crossed. He had allowed curiosity to push him into action. For Benedita, it thrust her into the center of a legal narrative she would later describe as coercive. For Delegado Firmino, it was a procedural milestone that required careful navigation in court. For Helena, the moment marked the end of social invisibility. The house that had been a stage for elegance became a courthouse exhibit. In the days that followed, legal instruments moved as they always do. Arrests, charges, the slow bubbling of court filings. The town watched and waited, and the rumor that had once been a secret passed into public record. Yet even in that legal transition, the themes that had shaped the story persisted. People who had once seen Helena as an aesthete began to see the aesthetic as a mask, a social currency that had been weaponized. Others, with a historian's detachment, saw in the case something more complex: the fragile line between scientific inquiry and moral transgression, the loneliness of a woman whose wealth allowed her privacy, and whose privacy, perhaps, enabled the concealment of a project that had no ethical guardrails. When the indictments were read and the first court date set, Manaus felt smaller and larger at once. Smaller because a private house had become the town's headline, larger because the consequences rippled beyond the city to the academic and medical communities that would later take interest. Professor Eduardo Almeida, an anthropologist who decades later would piece together fragments of the case, would argue that the Vasconcelos affair was not merely a local scandal, but a mirror of the period's anxieties about decay, modernity, and the cost of treating human life as laboratory material. But those are later reflections. In the heat of 1950, the practical questions were immediate and stark. Where were the missing men? What exactly did the notes detail? Who had helped, willingly or not? And, crucially, what would the public do with this knowledge? The town's first reactions were small and human. Families of the missing requested closure, one way or another. A few shops shut their signs in town out of shame or a desire to avoid association. Some social columns cut back on their coverage of parties. The church called for prayer, the municipal council called for order. The case would proceed into a courtroom where the vocabulary of law would try to pin meaning onto a set of acts that, outside legalese, had been both intimate and technical. Behind the formalities, the quieter symbolism persisted. The locked second-floor room, so long a fulcrum for rumor, was now an object of forensic interest. The perfume that had once been an accessory now seemed like a veneer. People whispered about beauty as a fragile currency, and families kept their daughters closer at dances. The town lived with a new kind of caution. Even as the court dates approached, a few anomalies remained unresolved. Some names listed in the cadernos could not be fully matched to known absences. Lists implied experiments that suggested prior years of testing. Some sources place the origin of Helena's activities as early as 1945, when she would have had access to the colonel's privacy and resources. The colonel's 1948 death padded that timeline against which Helena's activities had been recorded. Scholars and investigative journalists later would debate whether the operation had been ongoing, whether those early years represented mere trial and error or something more systematic. In 1950, the debate had a rawness. The town felt that history and rumor had collided. At stake, beyond the immediate legal outcomes, was the idea that a private pursuit, if left unchecked, could metastasize into public harm. That was in part what rallied Delegado Firmino to pursue the case with official rigor. His notes show a man committed to process, evidence inventories, witness interviews, chain of custody lists. He understood the political peril of entering a prominent household, and saw, in the clear documentation, a way to insulate the investigation from accusations of social impropriety. As the legal process took shape, the police archives and Helena's own cadernos began to circulate among a small group of researchers, doctors, and journalists who sensed that the case was not merely a scandal, but a document of something historically significant. The techniques described in those notebooks hinted at broader currents of thought, the period's fascination with preservation, with the promise of science to arrest decay, and with aesthetic ideals that valorize permanence. There was then a cultural context to the shock, a set of ideas about beauty and mortality that were current in certain circles of mid-century Latin America and Europe. Yet those intellectual questions do not lessen the human costs. Families continued to hole up in their homes, mourning absent sons and husbands. A commercial partner who had lost a business connection watched his ledgers for signs of embezzlement that might never become clear. The city, which for years had been animated by public spectacles, carnivals, dances, river festivals, felt a prudishness descend over its social calendar. People who had courted Helena either left town or chose carefully to avoid public association. Reputation, until then a flexible commodity in small-town life, contracted. For Helena herself, the trials were not simply legal. She faced the cooling of social goodwill, the curiosity of medical minds interested in her notes, and the pressure of a legal system that seeks definitive categories: guilty, not guilty, insane, responsible. In public statements, she tried to translate her work into a project of science, a study in permanence, an attempt to hold back time. Her language appealed to a kind of modernist ambition, to use method to combat the ravages of age. Whether that was a coherent defense or an aesthetic rationalization would, in the courtroom, become the central question. And yet, even as the town readied itself for public hearings, one question remained standing over them all like the dark river at night. How did a private fascination become a civic wound? The line between an eccentric experiment and criminal violation needed legal and moral delineation, but the social answer was less neat. The wrong here was not only procedural, it was cultural, and that made it harder to contain. The case would soon move into the public domain: formal charges, arraignments, the formation of a defense team that would invoke the language of research, and the possibility of mental aberration. The prosecution would assemble the documentary evidence, the cadernos, the lists, Benedita's statements, and the testimony of neighbors who had smelled what they described as chemical perfumes coming from the locked room. But that part, trial and sentencing, belongs to days after the raid, and to legal rituals that require a separate telling. Before that, there was the moment of the stakeout and the light in the second-floor window, a hinge that converted social desire into suspicion, and that pivoted a town from the comfortable grammar of admiration to the violent grammar of accusation. In that moment, the public who had once coveted Helena's presence and polish found themselves in possession of knowledge that made desire recoil. They could no longer see her the same way. What had been social currency became the substance that had to be accounted for. Ricardo, watching from his rented house, felt the heavy responsibility of someone who had seen and initiated action. He would later testify that he had stood in the dark and felt as if the house was a living thing with secrets it kept tucked behind shutters. The light that evening, and the motion he'd observed, provided him with the evidence he had sought, the certainty that something inside the bound house was being worked on in hours when respectable houses sleep. That fact, more than any single ledger or testimony, pushed the move from suspicion to legal procedure. When Firmino and his team stepped back into the daylight with sealed boxes, with catalogued papers, and the slow, formal language of evidence lists, Manaus understood a truth it had suspected but refused to face. The blend of beauty and secrecy had produced a wound that the town could not simply ignore. The social appetite that had once clustered around Helena was now transformed by the simple, austere processes of law. That transformation is at the heart of how the secret changed everything. In small towns, social networks are the scaffolding that holds reputations intact. When those networks fail, the collapse is not merely about the individual, but about the invisible bonds that made public life possible. Helena's beauty had once been the magnet that drew men and families into public association with her. The revelation of what that magnet concealed made those same associations dangerous and contagious in a new social sense. And yet, as the legal machinery prepared to test those associations, another set of forces began to gather. Scientists curious about the methods described in the notes, journalists eager for context and restraint, and a public whose appetite for scandal bordered on a hunger that could easily become destructive. The balance between reporting the facts and feeding a voyeuristic curiosity is a delicate one. In Manaus, for a time, both impulses led the town to hold its breath as the formalities of law played out. The case had another, quieter effect. It forced a conversation about the ethics of scientific pursuit, about the point at which curiosity requires the safeguard of consent, the protective cage of institutional oversight. In Helena's Cadernos, the language suggested an insulated experiment that had bypassed communal and ethical review. For men like Ricardo, a doctor schooled in modern medical norms, the absence of oversight and the presence of secretive practice were intolerable. In the months that followed, hearings would not only consider criminality, but also the blurry border between experimental zeal and moral culpability. But the raids and the notebooks did not, by themselves, close the moral questions. They opened them. For a community that had once viewed Helena as an ornament and a social node, the discovery demanded a reappraisal of values. Who is allowed privacy, and when does privacy cross into harm? The question would echo beyond the courtroom and into the city fabric, changing how people walked past that house, how mothers watched daughters at dances, how men measured their attention. It is in that suspended state, after the discovery but before full adjudication, that our first part of this story comes to a pause. The town had learned a truth. The value assigned to Helena had been a social currency convertible into influence and proximity. The discovery made that currency suspect. A handful of men were missing, a house had been opened. Notes suggested a program of preservation that conflated aesthetic desire with technical action. The police had boxes of evidence. The legal calendar had set a pace. What remained was the question of meaning. Helena's motives, whether pathological, aesthetic, or scientific, would be argued in court. The families of the missing would demand answers. The city would try to reconcile what it had admired with what it now had to condemn. And in the background the river kept flowing, indifferent to the fragile reputations tethered to its banks. On a humid night that same week, Ricardo returned to the rented house across from the Vasconcelos residence. There were more lights now in the city. Shutters were closed against curious eyes. From his vantage, he could see the stroke of activity that followed a raid, not flashy, but the quiet resettling of a house that had been turned inside out. He thought, briefly and privately, about the colonel's portrait on the wall and the ways in which his death had cleared a path for the events that followed. But he also felt the social rupture under his feet. A town that had wanted someone so badly it ignored the signs of trouble was now forced into the deliberate work of investigation. The story at this moment does not end. It gathers, the courtroom drama looming, Benedita's trembling testimony still to be passed, the Cadernos to be read page by page, the families who want closure. The secret had already changed the town by making private acts public, by converting admiration into suspicion, by altering social rituals and reputations. And in the dim distance, the locked second-floor room stood as a symbol of that change. A closed space that had once promised private taste and now promised to reveal the anatomy of a community's blind spot. What followed would be legal reckoning, public reassessment, and a cultural conversation whose echoes would last long after the walls of the Vasconcelos house were pulled down. The consequences had begun. The town had to decide what to do with what they now knew. If this account resonates with you and you follow the intersection of history and true crime, consider subscribing and telling us where you're watching from. The rest of this story, including the courtroom chronicles, Helena's defense, and the legacy that reached into the next decades, continues with a deeper look at the trial and its aftermath. The legal machinery turned slowly, the way apparatuses built to weigh human deeds must, deliberate, document-heavy, and bare of the gossip that had fed the first shocks. In the months that followed the search, Helena Vasconcelos moved from social centerpiece to the center of a criminal file. The sealed boxes from the second-floor room, cadernos, labeled glass, and instrument trays became the state's primary language. They were catalogued, photographed, and excerpted into courtroom exhibits. Witness lists were drawn. The families of the missing petitioned for answers, and the town that once vied for Helena's attention watched as a private life became subject to public proof. The prosecution's case was archival in texture. Investigators presented inventories that matched the names in Helena's notebooks with men whose social presence had ended. They offered Benedita's statements about the bundles she moved at dawn and the instructions she said she'd been given. Dr. Ricardo Mendez, who had taken the stakeout and pushed the initial inquiry, gave testimony that married observation to motive. The pattern of perfume masking chemical odors, the light in the second-floor room, the entries in the cadernos that read like laboratory logs. Medical and scientific witnesses were called to explain what the notebooks described: preservatives, long baths, methods meant to delay decomposition, without descending into lurid specificity. Their role was technical and austere, to translate Helena's vocabulary of permanence into the neutral terms of substance and method. Helena's defense, in turn, leaned on the vocabulary she herself had already used in writing. She framed her work as research, an aesthetic and quasi-scientific pursuit, a project to confront what time robs, as one of her notebook fragments put it. Counsel argued that the notes represented experimental curiosity, not criminal intent, that the mixtures and apparatus were consistent with a misguided attempt to study preservation rather than with a scheme of violence. At times, the defense advanced a soft attack, hinting at the possibility of mental disturbance, an isolated woman whose grief and vanity had produced an unmoored imagination. The effort was to move the facts into contexts the law might accept as mitigating: science, grief, madness. The court's task was narrower and harsher. Legal standards required causality, evidence of harm, and an account of who had aided and who had been coerced. Benedita's testimony was complicated. She told the court she had acted under orders, that fear and dependency had shaped her compliance. Sometimes her answers were halting. Sometimes she offered details that contradicted earlier statements in minor ways. The prosecution treated her as a witness who had been both accomplice and victim, someone whose proximity to Helena left her morally and legally entangled, but who could not be read as fully free in her choices. The tone in the courtroom was, for the most part, one of clinical attention. Reporters who did attend, discipline still possible in a city wary of scandal, described a spectacle of archivists' facts rather than melodrama. But outside, in parlors and on porch steps, the town was less composed. Conversations that had once centered on what dresses to wear now wondered aloud about what the possession of beauty also made possible. Fathers watched dances differently. Merchants recalculated what association meant. Private reputation had been reappraised as a public risk. The result of the trial was decisive in form, if complicated in feeling. The court found Helena guilty on charges related to the unlawful retention and manipulation of human remains, and on counts tied to the concealment of those presumed missing. She was sentenced to imprisonment, and municipal records show that, after the legal formalities, she was transferred to a penitentiary in Belém. Benedita received a reduced sentence, a legal recognition, however partial, of coercion and the inferior power dynamics that had made her vulnerable. The official language of the verdict was careful, guilty of acts that violated the dignity of the dead and the laws that protect a social order. For many in Manaus, the conviction read like confirmation. The secret had been proven, and the admiration that had once been currency evaporated under the sheen of legal consequence. Helena's years in confinement did not erase the traces of her project. Court files and correspondence that survive in municipal archives indicate she continued to write, letters, notes, and fragments that read as if she tried to translate her work into a defensible intellectual endeavor. Some documents suggest she maintained an interest in preservation techniques. Others read more like private diaries, iterations of the themes that had once animated her notebooks: permanence, beauty, and the refusal to accept natural decline. Whether these writings represented real scientific intent, a stubborn attempt at self-justification, or a psychological need to impose order, they shaped how later readers would interpret her life. Ultimately, Helena died in custody in 1958. The official records mark the date. The reasons for her death are a matter of record, but more complex in the realm of social meaning. Her passing closed one chapter and opened several others. The Vasconcelos house did not long survive as a preserved relic. In the years after Helena's transfer, the property fell into neglect and then into municipal plans for redevelopment and reclamation. The demolition of the house, an act that felt to some like cleansing and to others like erasure, was prosaic in form: contractors, permits, and the dull sound of masonry giving way. But the act also became an event in the communal memory. For a town reluctant to admit its vulnerabilities, pulling down the house was a way to reclaim a landscape that had been defiled by scandal. It was during one of the clearances in the late 1960s that workers uncovered what would become another unsettling chapter. In 1968, in the earth beneath where the house had stood, a hidden chamber was found, an underground space that suggested the Vasconcelos property had more architecture of secrecy than anyone had expected. The chamber contained artifacts and evidence that extended in fragments the story told by the Cadernos. For researchers and officials, the find raised new questions about the scale and duration of the experiments, and about the ways that privacy had been engineered into a property, not merely a locked upstairs room, but literal subterranean spaces that removed activity from curious sightlines. The discovery rekindled scholarly and medical interest. One of the figures who took a sustained interest was Professor Eduardo Almeida, an anthropologist whose later writings would treat the Vasconcelos case as a touchstone for mid-century anxieties about modernity and preservation. Almeida's approach was methodical. He sought to situate Helena's notebooks within wider currents of scientific thought, and to understand how a provincial elite might have borrowed European ideas about preservation and beauty. He was interested in the intellectual genealogy, how concepts move from laboratories and salons into private households where they mix with grief and desire. Almeida's work was not without controversy. He navigated a field that mixed anthropology, forensic curiosity, and local memory, and his presence in Manaus, asking professionals, reading municipal archives, interviewing older witnesses, ran into the town's wounds. In the early 1960s, he published articles and undertook field work that would make him a visible interpreter of the case. His career thereafter was tangled in the residue of that visibility. He had allies who praised his restraint and critics who accused him of turning the dead into objects of analysis. The record notes that Almeida died under circumstances that some later described as suspicious, an ambiguity that fed further rumor but that official sources treat cautiously. His death did not resolve the debates he had sparked. It merely added another layer of speculation to a story already heavy with it. Across decades, the Vasconcelos affair took on the contours of legend. It became a cautionary tale in family narratives, a case study in university seminars, and a subject of the occasional journalistic revisiting. For Manaus, it served as a muscle memory about what can happen when social deference shields private acts. The city that once measured itself by dances and imported silks found itself also measuring its capacity to investigate, regulate, and remember. Memory, in this instance, did two things. It preserved the fact of scandal, names, dates, documents, but it also transmuted the event into moral language. Mothers told their daughters not to accept gifts from men who spoke too sweetly. Club members reconsidered which public figures they allowed into leadership, and the municipal records were consulted again when families felt unease about privacy and power. The case shaped local conversation about consent and oversight. It also drew the attention of scholars curious about the cultural history of preservation, how, in a modernizing world, the desire for permanence could be framed as both scientific ambition and aesthetic compulsion. One of the enduring ironies of the story is that Helena's own stated project, preserving beauty against decay, has a conceptual resonance beyond the criminal acts attributed to her. Societies, too, try to preserve themselves, the rituals, the reputations, the public calendars that give social life its rhythm. In that sense, Helena's notebooks read as a grotesque parallel to communal efforts to hold a town's identity stable in the face of time. Where the town sought continuity through reputation and ritual, Helena sought it through chemical stasis. Both projects reveal anxieties about loss, and both show how methods of preservation can become ethically unstable when divorced from consent and accountability. There is a tenderness, too, in the way the missing are remembered. Men like Sebastião Moura, Carlos Eduardo Santos, and Dr. Antonio Ferreira, names that moved from social rotation into lists of absence, are not merely footnotes. Families kept photographs in drawers. Ledger entries in shop books still show unpaid invoices. The factual lacunae that the police could not fully resolve, some names in the notebooks do not match clear legal accounts, create a sorrowful ambiguity, a town with partial answers and continuing questions. By returning to the title premise, the magnetism Helena once had, we can trace the arc of desire turned to disquiet. Everyone wanted her was true in the social sense. Men courtship, invitations, carved out reputations. Those attentions were both tribute and instrument. In a place where social life is scarce and highly visible, the allocation of attention is a form of currency. The discovery of her secret changed that currency into contamination. What was once a marker of advantage became a vector of risk. The town's social economy recalibrated itself. The allure that had once guaranteed proximity now warned against it. The lasting lesson is not tidy. The Vasconcelos case resists simple moralizing because it sits at the intersection of grief, science, vanity, and social structure. It shows how social deference can become a cloak for harmful behavior, how scientific language can be misused to sanitize private obsessions, and how legal systems struggle to translate intimate acts into public criminality. It also exposes a communal vulnerability. In small cities, where everyone knows everyone, secrecy is harder to hide and easier to contaminate the social commons. More than half a century later, the story still carries a charge. Scholars sift through cadernos in archives. Local storytellers retell the house as a ghostly caution. Descendants of those involved live with reputations reshaped by events they did not choose. The river keeps moving. The same dark current that carried the riverboats in Helena's day still pulls at the city's edges, and Manaus continues its work of self-fashioning. When people pass the place where the house once stood, or when they hear the names in old records, they are touching an old wound that has never quite healed. In the end, the secret of Manaus did not merely put one woman behind bars. It reconfigured a town's understanding of desire and danger. The love and attention that once elevated Helena were, in time, what revealed the very practices that demanded accountability. A community learned, harshly and publicly, that admiration, unchecked, can become complicity, that privacy, when used to conceal harm, becomes a public problem, and that scientific language, without ethical guardrails, risks rationalizing harm. Everyone wanted her, until the secret of Manaus changed everything. Today, the story remains not only a piece of criminal history, but a mirror, a reminder of how fragile social trust can be, how quickly admiration can curdle into suspicion, and how the pursuit of permanence, whether by people or by communities, must be tethered to laws and humane limits. If you want to dig deeper into the archival documents and the cadernos that inform this account, check the description for sources and a link to our full archive deep dive.